Today we're kicking off a new series called the 2019 Off-Season Plan Report, where we take a look at all 31 NHL teams. We're going to break this down into a few different segments. We're going to start by recapping the season that was just completed for the 18-19 season. We're going to take a look at their cap situation, pending UFAs, RFAs, etc., and what changes they need to make to get better for next year. Today we're kicking it off with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and that's coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams, so if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned, today we're kicking off a new series. This is video number 1 of 31, and we're kicking things off here with the Toronto Maple Leafs 2019 NHL Off-Season Plan. So we're going to kick things off here by recapping the 2018-19 season for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Let's take a look at some of the team and individual results that really stood out here. So the Toronto Maple Leafs finished the season with a 46-28-8 record for third place in the Atlantic Division, finishing with 100 points. Obviously, this is the third consecutive years that they qualified for the playoffs. Unfortunately, it was also the third consecutive year where they ended up with a first-round loss in the playoffs, in the second consecutive year where they had and it's the second consecutive year where they had a long, hard-fought series against the Boston Bruins, but ultimately fell in Game 7, losing the series 4-3. Now, obviously, taking a look at some of the key highlights for the team here, they were the fourth highest scoring team in the NHL, registering 286 goals, so they certainly had no problem putting the puck in the net. Goals against was slightly below average at 18th best, allowing 251 goals. Now, their power play was relatively strong early in the year, but in the second half and into the playoffs wasn't as good. Hard to say exactly what happened, but they definitely need to make some adjustments there. They did finish, though, with a really strong 21.8% power play, but early in the year, as I mentioned, it was going at a much higher rate. On the PK, they were pretty average at 79.9%. Usually you aim for at least 80%, and that's pretty much where they are, but there certainly is some room there to get better as well. Now I want to take a look at their goaltending results from Frederik Andersen and some of their top scorers. Frederik Andersen appeared in 60 games played this year with a record of 36, 16, and 7. He finished with a 2.77 goals against average and a .917 save percentage. Now, early in the season, I think it's fair to say Frederik Andersen was probably their MVP. He was putting up some stellar numbers, but you can't help but wonder if maybe they need to scale back the number of games he plays here, because down the stretch and into the playoffs, I just felt, again, he wasn't quite as good, and he also failed to deliver in Game 7, which is something he's yet to do in his career. He has never won a Game 7 playoff series yet so far, so I wonder if he might be tiring out as the season goes on. I do understand that they played him as much as they did because they didn't have as much confidence in their backup goaltending, and that's something that we're going to address here later in the video. But Frederik Andersen overall is a solid goaltender. They definitely have themselves a solid number 1, but they need to continue to work with him. I do think there's a little bit more of an opportunity for him to improve his game just a little bit more here yet again to get in more into elite company on the upper echelon of goaltenders, but he's certainly a top 10 goalie for sure in the NHL, so they have themselves a solid guy, which is something they were greatly missing before they traded for him a number of years back here. Now, taking a look at some of their top individual scorers, obviously they had lots of offensive output. Mitch Marner led the way with 94 points. Obviously, Marner is one of their top playmaking wingers, certainly one of the tops in the league. John Tavares had a phenomenal first year in Toronto, getting close to 50 goals, putting up 88 points. Austin Matthews, again, was more than a point per game, 73 points in 68 games. If he can stay healthy, that'll be big for them next year as well. And Morgan Rielly had a breakout year as well, putting up 72 points, and obviously was not nominated for the Norris Trophy, but certainly deserved to be in that conversation, in my opinion, for sure. Morgan Rielly really stepped up his game, and is certainly a legitimate number 1 defenseman for the Leafs, for sure. So overall, the Maple Leafs had a really solid season on many levels, but their first half was way better than the second half. As the year went on, things were not kind of keeping up here. Things were kind of falling to the wayside, and there's certainly a lot of question marks around some of the adjustments that maybe the coaching staff could have made or didn't make or whatnot, what happened to the Leafs during the second half of the year. You can't help but wonder as well, being in the Atlantic Division, being in that top 3 spots, you could probably say the same thing to a degree about the Tampa Bay Lightning and what happened with them, is they were kind of known for a long time where they were going to finish in the standings, and they weren't playing as meaningful hockey as they were early in the year to kind of gain themselves that position in the division standings, and maybe they just kind of lost focus a little bit or something, but the coaching staff needs to be able to make adjustments there to keep them him on track and keep flipping at such a high rate like they were early on. This is something I've noticed the past few years with the Leafs. They always start off really, really strong, but things kind of level out here as the season goes on, and then obviously you don't finish as strong as you were hoping for, but that does to a degree here fall on the coaching staff in my opinion, and I'll address that here a little bit later in the video as well. Now let's take a look at their cap situation and any pending contracts that need to be looked after this year, so pending RFAs and pending UFAs here as well. Now on the RFA front, there's lots of big names and contracts that need to get looked after here. As you can see, the top one by far, Mitch Marner, their top scorer, 94 points this year. He is going to be getting a mega contract for sure. I know the Leafs would love to get him locked up long term on a nice contract, so we'll see what happens, but obviously that is huge for them. They also have Kasperi Kapanen and Andreas Johnsson to look after as well. There is some debate whether or not all of these guys are going to return, obviously, because they do have some hard decisions to make, but we'll get into that here in the next segment. They also have Igor Ozhiganov as a pending RFA as well. He's pretty much all but gone. There's been some reports that he's likely going to go back and sign with the KHL, and I've seen reports from Sportsnet's Chris Johnson, who was there during locker cleanup day, and basically said he's all but gone. More likely not returning. I've seen reports from Darren Dreger saying the Leafs did have some interest in bringing him back, but I really don't see it happening with all the contracts they have to look after and some improvements on defense that they definitely want to make. I really don't see him as being part of the future here. You never know, but I think pretty much he's all but gone. Taking a look at the UFA front, obviously the biggest name on that list is defenseman Jake Gardiner. Now I know Jake Gardiner is a little bit of a polarizing figure, a little bit of a lightning rod for criticism amongst many within the Leafs fans. I know there's certainly those out there who like Jake Gardiner and appreciate what he brings to the team. But it is unfortunate that he seems to not have his best moments in Game 7 and therefore takes a lot of criticism, and it's going to prove difficult for the Leafs to re-sign Gardiner this offseason. But Gardiner is a major reason why the offense does run along so smoothly at times, because that puck-moving defenseman on the back end like him and Riley can do certainly go a long way in helping move the puck up the ice, get it out of the zone, etc. So I do think Gardiner is much more valuable than many people give him credit for, and if he is not there next year, depending on what they can replace him with, you very well might see a big difference. But obviously the area on the blue line is something that the Leafs need to address and something we'll get into here in the next segment as well. But he's definitely by far their biggest name on the UFA list. They've also got forward Tyler Ennis, who certainly was a nice fit on the fourth line. Didn't play every night. He appeared in 51 games, put up 12 goals, but overall certainly had his moments where he looked pretty valuable to the team. It's basically a 13th forward for the most part of the year, but he had his times where he fit in quite nicely and was able to give them another offensive option on that fourth line, and I do see him possibly re-signing with the Leafs on another short-term, fairly cheap team-friendly contract. Now, of course, they also have some other defensemen on this list as well, like veteran Ron Hainsey and Martin Marincin. I think it's probably pretty safe to say, like Ozhiganov, Marincin probably isn't coming back. He really didn't play a lot, and when he did, he didn't look good. Many, like myself, are not really convinced he's a regular NHL defenseman. I'm not sure that he's going to get a one-way contract with any NHL club. You never know, but I would be a little bit surprised based on his limited play and not so great results. That would be a little bit surprising, so I don't see the Leafs bringing him back. They have many other younger defensemen they can give that spot to, and obviously the veteran Ron Hainsey. I wouldn't completely rule out the fact that he may not be back. It certainly is quite possible. I guess he'll probably explore free agency a little bit and see what else is out there. He's probably going to be wanting to see what terms might be available. Obviously, he's getting up there. It didn't sound like he was leaning towards retirement, although that's not a question I've really seen him answer a whole lot. And at this point in the year, might not really be ready to answer anyway, but Hainsey is an option to possibly bring back if they can kind of reorganize their defense core, that he can maybe play down in the lineup a little bit and maybe take a cheaper contract and take a smaller role, then it's certainly a possibility. But if another team comes calling with a little bit more term and more money and wants him to play higher in their lineup and get a bigger role, then that might be something that he might take a chance to do. It kind of depends on where he's at with his career. It's also going to be a question we're going to get into in the next segment, and that's kind of a battle here between Coach Mike Babcock and General Manager Kyle Dubas. They certainly have a little bit of a different philosophy in who they want for players, and that might play a role in who stays and who goes and how this offseason moves ahead here. Of course, we also have backup goaltender Michael Hutchison, who basically took the spot from Garrett Sparks for the playoffs. Of course, he's a UFA. They do have Sparks under contract next year. I think it's pretty safe to say the organization has lost confidence in Garrett Sparks, so they might attempt to re-sign Hutchison. He didn't do too bad in the limited action he's seen, but it's hard to say exactly. They're going to need somebody who they can get on a cheap contract. Like when they had Curtis McElhinney, that was the perfect backup goaltender for them. And the level of experience he brought, the confidence he could provide, and putting him in the net for a number of games that they could rely on him, and also the contract worked well for their situation as well. So maybe they try to bring him back. He's on a short-term contract in Carolina. Hard to say if they go down that road or a different one. But either way, it's debatable whether or not Michael Hutchison returns for the Maple Leafs. Taking a look at their cap space, as you can see on the screen here, they have 17 contracts committed for next year with a cap hit of $74.2 million. So that's a lot of money. Obviously, the salary cap's expected to be somewhere around $83 million. Could very well land right in the middle of that, around 82.5. We don't have the firm confirmation on that here just yet, but either way, that's not a ton of room. So they're going to have some choices to be made here with some of these guys, because many of these guys are going to take a lot of money to keep in the organization. Now, one other thing they do have, the salary cap that gives them a little bit of flexibility. They do have the contract still for Nathan Horton that they did in that David Clarkson trade a number of years ago. He still has not been placed on LTIR, but he could be. He's making $5.3 million, and he has one more year left on that contract. So that is an option, and they can use some long-term injury reserve relief to kind of accommodate some of this here as well. So they do have a little bit more flexibility than it might show, or they might even be able to make a trade with another team to take that contract on instead of using that LTIR space. But of course, if they do that, they're likely going to have to give up another more intriguing asset to go with it, either a draft pick or a decent prospect or something to that effect, if another team that might need to get to the salary floor is willing to take that on for them. Now, as far as what they need to take a look at here to get better for next season, that's obviously the big question mark for many of these clubs, and certainly an area we want to focus on here with all these teams. For the Maple Leafs, I think it's pretty clear that there's two main areas. They need a more solid, reliable backup goaltender. I don't think Garrett Sparks is that guy. He's certainly proved to be unreliable here so far. I know they had some tough choices to make early last season. They had McElhinney, they had Pickard, they had Sparks. It kind of did make sense to me in a way that they do go with Sparks, but it has not worked out very well at all. He is under contract next year. It's not a very big money contract. If they can develop the confidence, which I'm not sure how they're going to, that he can take on maybe 25 to 30 games for the Leafs, give Anderson more rest and give them better results, then they can run with that. But I really don't think that that's going to be the case. I can see maybe them exploring the trade market with Sparks and trying to get a more reliable backup. They need to be able to take the workload off Freddie Anderson a little bit more. I think maybe 60 games for him might even still be too much based on how he played down the stretch and into the playoffs. It wasn't terrible, but you could tell to me that he was still looking to be a little bit tired, and if they had a little bit more flexibility here down the stretch, it would have helped here a little bit more. So I do think they need to watch his load management just a little bit, and it can address that through having a more solid backup. Obviously, lots of questions on defense as well. It's an area they do need to get better at. If you take a look at their goals against that we just discussed in the early segment here, obviously they were 18th best in the NHL. There's still room to make that better. You want to get into the top 10 for sure, and you need to have some more solid guys on the D side. They have their puck movers, which they could be losing in Jake Gardiner, but I do really think they need to address this defense core. They brought in Jake Muzzin as a trade during the season. He's worked out relatively well. Overall, I think that's a pretty solid deal to get Morgan Riley. Hard to say what happens with Ron Hainsey. Hard to say what happens with Jake Gardiner. But if one or both of those guys end up walking due to contracts through the free agency door here, they need to find a way to address that decor and have another solid top four guy. They could have another solid, more defensive style partner for a Morgan Riley, for example, might be a way to go. Hard to say. I mean, they also have some guys in the system like Travis Dermott who might be able to take on more of a role. They have Calle Rosen, who's under a one-way contract next year, so he might be the answer. They do have Rasmus Sandin and Timothy Liljegren in the prospect system who might be able to address some of these needs as well, because they are going to need many guys with cheaper contracts to make the salary cap situation work. I'm not sure that either of those guys are really ready. I think Rosen might be able to take on more of a role, but it's hard to say if he'll be a full-timer or not. In the other cases of Sandin and Liljegren, I don't have as much confidence in Liljegren. I don't think he's developed quite as much as they were hoping for so far. I know they're really high on Sandin, but it might not be. Next year might be another year really before he's ready. I can see either of them getting some games due to injuries or whatnot throughout the year. I'm just not sure that either of them are ready for that full-time limelight in Toronto. So exploring a way to bring in another defenseman like they did with Jake Muzzin in that top four likely is something that they need to address for sure. The forward group is certainly an area of strength for them. They have an abundance of forwards who can score. So overall, I don't expect too many changes with that forward group. Obviously, they have some guys with contracts that need to get looked after, and it's hard to say how that's going to work out. They might not be able to keep everybody, and obviously they might be able to use one of their forwards as an area of strength to make a trade to obtain that defenseman that we were just discussing here. Prospect forwards that might be able to get a look. Trevor Morris looked good here. I think he's still fair to call him a prospect, and I think the odds of him getting more of a full-time spot next year are pretty good. Obviously, they brought in Nick Petan, who's still kind of in that prospect area, but he's getting a little older and to be considered one, really. Obviously, Jeremy Bracco's looked pretty decent with the Marlies, so I'm not sure if any of those guys can garner themselves a full-time spot, but like I said, the Leafs are going to have a lot of cheap contracts that they need to have on their roster in order to make everything work. So obviously having those guys in the mix will be key as well. But the big thing for me is it's hard to say right now, is Coach Mike Babcock going to be back next year? You would think he would be, based on the fact he still has a number of years left on his contract with fairly hefty salary, but during their end of year media availability, listen to Babcock talk, listen to Dubas talk. You can't help but wonder. We've already had some question marks around their relationship. Kyle Dubas took on a lot of the blame for their failures this year and not advancing further into the playoffs and getting closer to that Stanley Cup that they're trying to accomplish here. And really, when he was asked point blank, is Babcock returning next year, he wouldn't come out and give him a strong endorsement to say, yes, of course he is. He's my coach. He's under contract. We have no desire to make a change there. We can always work to get better, make some adjustments or something to that degree, but he didn't do that, which I found really odd. Obviously, when Babcock did his availability, he didn't really seem to be taking on much of a blame of anything himself either, which I also found strange. It's okay to admit that maybe you could make some adjustments for the following year. You don't have to blame yourself too much. I think Dubas might have taken on too much of the blame, really, in my opinion, but either way, that relationship looks strained. Dubas had mentioned that Shanahan will be doing a full evaluation of everybody, including himself, and that he wasn't really sure exactly if any changes that would be made, but that he would let everybody know once decisions were made going forward. So it's really kind of an odd situation in my opinion. I really don't see Babcock getting fired, but I can see maybe some adjustments to their assistant coaching staff as well, looking after special teams. There's certainly areas of improvement that need to be improved upon. There's certainly areas that need to be looked upon for next year. Like I said, the second half of the year, the power play especially really lost its steam, and that falls on the assistant coaches as well, and the PK needs to get better too. So, and there's certainly been some speculation that one of their assistants, DJ Smith, might be having opportunities to maybe get in a head coaching job with other teams, but not really sure that's going to happen here just yet. But it's certainly, he's been a name that's been out there for potential other opportunities. One big question I have for you, is Mike Babcock definitely going to be returning here with the Maple Leafs? Do you see any kind of a fracture in the relationship between him and Kyle Dubas? And might they possibly take a look at making some changes in this regard? So to summarize here, I guess we could see some big things happen here with the Leafs this year. The big thing is going to be whether or not we find out any changes to the coaching staff. They really need to do a good job of looking after their RFAs before July 1st to protect them from being, potentially receiving offer sheets. They don't want to run into a situation like they did with Nylander last year. They need to get these contracts looked after as soon as possible, decide who they're signing, who they might have to trade. They could use the NHL draft here in June before free agency kicks in as an opportunity to start making trades if they need to go down that road, depending on what they decide to do here. But they don't want to wait too long. Dubas did acknowledge as well that the Nylander situation, he took a lot of the blame for that dragging on as long as it did. So certainly will be interesting to see what they do here. They definitely want to get things looked after as soon as possible so they can prepare for the rest of the year going into next year strong. And if there's any decisions that have to be made in free agency, they have a better idea where everything else sits before they get there. So, of course, as always, I want to know your thoughts and opinions on the Toronto Maple Leafs. What do you expect from them during this offseason? What kind of changes do you think they'll be making to the team and to this roster to get better for next season? And as I mentioned, 30 more videos just like this one coming up here, covering all 31 teams in this series. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.